Don't make a scene, Alara. You were never really one of us anyway. She said it across the fine Royal Doulton china the night before we buried my grandmother, and she was smiling. The whole table heard her. My grandmother wasn't even in the ground yet, and my mother announced out loud that the estate would go to my sister, the real daughter. I would get nothing, because I had never truly been one of them. My aunt stared at her plate. My father refilled his claret, and my sister reached over, squeezed my mother's hand, and looked at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong by sitting at that table. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I'd had 30 years of practice at not flinching. What none of them knew was that there was a sealed envelope in my coat pocket. My grandmother had ordered it before she died and paid for it in secret and left instructions that I was the only one allowed to open it. 6 weeks later, my mother would be the one begging the solicitor to start the meeting over. But that night, she still thought she'd won. The quietest person at that table had already started counting the days. For 34 years, I'd been the wrong daughter in the right family, and I had finally stopped trying to fix it. My grandmother's name was Beatrix Donovan, and she died on a Tuesday in late April. The call came while I was at work sorting probate files for a man I'd never met, which is the kind of joke my life has always told without laughing. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to the dinner because the dinner is where everything that was already broken finally showed its seams. We were at my parents' house in the suburbs outside Winchester. Clementina and Alistair Ellsworth, married 38 years. The kind of couple who hung a wooden sign in the kitchen that said, "Family is everything," and meant a very specific version of it. The funeral was the next morning. Tradition in our family was a dinner the night before. And tradition in our family was also that I sat at the end of the table near the kitchen door, close enough to be useful, far enough to be forgotten. My sister Saffron sat at the center where she always sat. Saffron is 2 years older than me, blonde where I'm dark, easy where I'm careful. Growing up, she was the one whose drawings went on the fridge and whose report cards got framed. She was the one my mother called my girl. I was the one my mother called by my full name when she was disappointed, which was most of the time. That night, the talk turned the way it always did within an hour, to the estate. My grandmother had owned a cottage in the Lake District, the Donovan place, 3 generations of summers, a jetty my grandfather built by hand. There was also a trust. Nobody said numbers out loud because in my family, saying numbers out loud was vulgar, but everybody at that table knew the Lake District cottage was worth more than my parents' house, and everybody knew who they assumed would get it. Saffron is the eldest, my mother said, to no one and everyone. Mother would want it kept in good hands. Good hands. I looked at my own hands around my water glass and said nothing. It was then that I made the mistake of mentioning I'd spoken to my grandmother's solicitor. I hadn't meant anything by it. He'd called me, not the other way around. But the table went quiet and my mother's smile tightened. And that's when she said the thing about how I was never really one of them. Anyway, so here is what you should know about me before this goes any further. My name is Alara Ellsworth. I'm 34. I work as a legal executive at a probate law firm, which means I spend my days reading other families' wills and watching how money turns people into strangers. I live alone in a 1-bedroom flat on the east side of London with a cat named Biscuit and a grandmother. I loved more than anyone who shared my surname. If you grew up the kid who was tolerated instead of wanted, if you ever sat at a family table and felt like a guest in your own bloodline, then you already know the rest of the story in your body. Even if you don't know the details yet, stay with me because the details are where it turns. And if any of this is landing too close to home, do me a favor and tell me in the comments which town you're listening from because I want to know I'm not the only one who learned to set a table she was never welcome at. Now, let me tell you what it took 30 years to learn. I don't have one big memory of being unwanted. That's not how it works. It's 1,000 small ones stacked. I have the memory of being 8 and bringing home a spelling trophy and my mother saying, "That's nice," and then turning to ask Saffron about her ballet recital. I have the memory of family photos where Saffron is held and I am standing slightly to the side like a kid who wandered into the frame. I have the memory of my father teaching Saffron to drive in the church car park and, when it was my turn 2 years later, paying for an instructor instead so he wouldn't have to sit in the car with me. The phrase changed shape over the years, but never the meaning. Alara marches to her own drum. Alara was always the independent one. You know how Alara is, she doesn't need much. They built a whole personality for me out of the things they withheld, and then praised me for not needing them. The cruelest part is that I believed it. I thought I was just difficult to love. I thought there was something wrong in me that my own mother could feel and I couldn't see. I spent my 20s in therapy, which I paid for myself, trying to find the defect. The thing that made me the daughter you tolerate instead of the daughter you choose. The only person who ever made me feel chosen was Beatrix. My grandmother had a way of looking at me like I was the answer to a question she'd been asking for years. When I was 12, she taught me to play gin rummy on the screened porch of the Lake District cottage. And she let me win exactly often enough that I knew when she let me. She told me I had her mother's hands. She told me I had her own stubbornness, the good kind, the kind that survives things. She never once made me feel like I was standing slightly to the side. But Beatrix lived 3 hours away, and my mother controlled the calendar. And somewhere around the time I was 14, the Lake District visits got rarer, and then they stopped including me at all. By the time I was 19, I'd left. I didn't leave with a fight. There was no slammed door, no speech. That's not our family style. We end things politely by attrition. I went to a local college, then transferred to university, then took a job 2 hours away and simply stopped coming back for the minor bank holidays. I came for Christmas and the big things. I sent cards. I called my grandmother every Sunday. The distance was easier than the table. At the table, I was a guest who'd overstayed. At a distance, I could be a daughter in theory, which was the only way they seemed able to love me. In theory, from far away where I couldn't disappoint anyone by actually needing something, for about a decade, that was the arrangement. I built a small, quiet life. I was good at my job. I had 2 friends I'd trust with my life and a cat who tolerated me. I stopped auditioning for my mother's approval, mostly. I told myself I'd made peace with being the daughter who didn't quite belong. I almost believed it. And then my grandmother got sick and the careful little piece I'd built started coming apart at the first seam. Beatrix was diagnosed in the autumn. I found out the way I found out most things about my own family, late and by accident. Saffron posted a photo online of the whole clan at the cottage captioned "Precious Time with Gran." I hadn't been told there was precious time to be had. I hadn't been invited. I called Beatrix that Sunday like always and I asked her, careful, whether she was okay. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Alara, come up next weekend. Just you, don't tell your mother. Don't tell your mother." I should have known then that something was already in motion. I drove up the next Saturday. The cottage smelled like wood smoke and the lavender soap she'd used my whole life. She was thinner, slower, but her eyes were the same. Sharp, amused, seeing me. We played gin rummy. She let me win. And then she stopped pretending to let me win and beat me 3 hands straight, laughing. And then somewhere in the long blue afternoon, she put her cards down and looked at me the way she did, like I was the answer to a question. "Alara," she said, "I have to ask you something and I need you to not lie to me to be polite." I said, "Okay, how did they make you feel?" She asked, "All those years, your mother and your father, tell me the true thing, not the polite thing." And for some reason, maybe because she was dying, maybe because no one had ever asked, I told her the true thing. I told her I'd grown up feeling like a coat someone forgot to take home. I told her about the photos where I stood to the side. I told her I'd spent 15 years and a lot of money trying to find what was wrong with me. She listened to all of it without moving. When I finished, there were tears on her face, but her voice was steady. And what she said next is the sentence that started everything. "There was never anything wrong with you," she said. "And I think I know why they did it. I've thought I've known for a long time, I just didn't have the proof. And I wasn't going to break this family open on a feeling." I asked her what she meant. She took my hand. She had a paper, soft grip, and a wedding ring she'd never taken off. "I've taken care of it," she said. "When I'm gone, Mr. Sterling will call you, not your mother. You. He has something for you. Open it alone. And Alara, whatever it says, it does not change that you are always mine." I asked her, "Please just tell me now." She shook her head. "If I tell you, you'll spend my last months looking at your mother instead of me. Let me have you a little longer." So I let her. I drove up 4 more times that winter. We played gin rummy until she got too tired for cards and then we just sat. She never explained. And in late April on a Tuesday, she died in her sleep, with my Sunday card on her nightstand. The funeral was the morning after the dinner where my mother told me I was never one of them. Mr. Sterling found me at the wake afterward in the church hall, while my mother accepted condolences like a queen and Saffron stood beside her in tasteful black. He was an old man with kind, tired eyes, and he'd been my grandmother's solicitor for over 30 years. "Miss Ellsworth," he said quietly, "Alara, your grandmother left specific instructions. Can you come to my office on Thursday alone before the family reading? Across the room, my mother watched us talk. I felt her eyes like a hand on the back of my neck. I told him yes. There's an envelope, he said, lower still. She was very particular that it goes to you and only you. She also asked me to give you this now. He pressed a folded note into my palm. She wrote it the week before she passed. I waited until I was in my car to open it. 3 lines in her shaking hand. My Alara, the truth is heavy, but it sets you down somewhere solid. You'll know what to do because you're the one of them who was never cruel. Love always, Beatrix. I sat in the church car park and read it 11 times. Then I drove home and I did not sleep. And on Thursday, I went to find out what my grandmother had spent her last good months arranging. Mr. Sterling's office smelled like old paper and tea. He sat me down, folded his hands, and told me the first piece. Your grandmother changed her will last October, he said quietly. She did it here with 2 witnesses, fully competent. I had her evaluated because I suspected the family might contest. The cottage and the Donovan Trust do not pass the way your parents have assumed. I asked him how they pass. To her direct blood descendants, he said specifically. She was very precise about the wording, and she attached a condition. He slid a thick envelope across the desk. It was sealed with the laboratory's return address in the corner. She ordered this last September. She asked me to hold it and give it to you unopened after her death. She said you should be the first person on earth to read it. I asked what it was. I don't know the result, he said. I only know what she ordered. It's a grandparentage DNA analysis from an accredited lab. She provided her own sample and she provided 2 others. My hands had gone cold. I asked whose. Yours, he said, and your sister's. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because it wasn't triumph. And it wasn't even fear. It was a kind of vertigo. For 30 years, I'd believed the problem was me. And here was my grandmother from beyond her own grave telling me that maybe the problem had never been me at all. And she'd spent her last strength making sure I could prove it. I asked Mr. Sterling how she got our samples. He almost smiled. Your sister sent her a hairbrush as a gift 2 Christmases ago, he said. Some ancestry kit fad. Beatrix kept it. And you? You cut your hand at the cottage last autumn on the jetty. Do you remember? She kept the plaster. I remembered. I'd torn my palm on a nail and she'd fussed over me for an hour. She'd been collecting evidence while she dressed my wound. My stubborn, brilliant, dying grandmother. I opened the envelope in his office. He offered to leave. I asked him to stay. The report was 4 pages of dense technical language. But the lab had been kind enough to put a plain English summary on the first page in a gray box, and I read it 3 times before the words held still. The maternal lineage analysis was conclusive. Alara Ellsworth and the deceased Beatrix Donovan shared the expected mitochondrial profile and grandparentage markers consistent with a direct biological grandmother-granddaughter relationship. The probability was greater than 99.9%. And then the second name, Saffron Ellsworth and the deceased Beatrix Donovan, were excluded. The markers were not consistent with a biological relationship through the maternal line. The report's careful language was that Saffron could not be the biological grandchild of Beatrix Donovan through Clementina Ellsworth. I read it a 4th time. I made Mr. Sterling read it out loud because I no longer trusted my own eyes. Saffron, the eldest, the chosen, the true heir, my mother's girl, was not my mother's biological daughter. And I, the one who was never really one of them, was the only blood my grandmother had left. I asked Mr. Sterling the only question that mattered. Does my mother know what this says? No, he said. No one does. Only you. That was Beatrix's instruction. She wanted you to decide what to do with it. I sat in that quiet office holding a piece of paper that rearranged 30 years of my life, and I understood finally that the dinner table had never been about who I was. It had been about who Saffron wasn't and who knew. I didn't tell anyone for 2 weeks. I needed to be sure of the ground before I stepped on it because I have spent my career watching people detonate their lives on documents they didn't fully understand. So, I did what I'm trained to do. I investigated. The first thing I did was verify the lab. Mr. Sterling gave me the chain of custody paperwork and I called the lab directly, posing as exactly what I was, a legal executive confirming an accredited result for an estate matter. The lab was real, ISO accredited, the kind whose results stand up in court. My grandmother hadn't ordered some high-street novelty. She'd ordered the real thing, the thing that gets entered into evidence. The second thing I did was build a timeline because a result tells you what, but never why. And I needed the why before I sat across from my mother. I started with Saffron's birth. I'd never had a reason to look closely before. Saffron was born in the spring of 1990. I was born in the late spring of 1992. We'd always been told the same story. Mom and Dad married young, 2 girls 2 years apart, the perfect family. But when I actually thought about it, the story had holes I'd never noticed because no one points a torch at a story that flatters them. My parents married in 1988. My mother had always said with a little drama that she nearly died having Saffron and that it took her years to recover, which was the family's tidy explanation for the gap before me. I'd accepted it my whole life. Now I held it up to the light. I called the one person who might talk. My mother's younger sister, my Aunt Josephine. Aunt Josephine had always been kinder to me than the rest in the offhand way of someone who notices a thing but isn't going to start a row over it. I told her I was helping settle Gran's estate and had some questions about old family dates for the paperwork. A lie with a true skeleton. She was happy to reminisce. And reminiscing without meaning to, she handed me the first real thread. "Oh, those were such strange years," she said. "Your mum and Alistair wanted a baby so badly and just couldn't. Years of it. Clem was a wreck. And then all of a sudden, Saffron like a miracle. Your grandmother used to say. Clem went away that whole spring to rest and came back with the baby. And nobody asked questions because you didn't back then." I kept my voice level. I asked where she went to rest. "Down south somewhere. Alistair's people had family in Cornwall." A pause. "Why, sweetheart?" I said it was nothing, just dates. We talked about the cottage. I thanked her and hung up and sat with my heart going like a fist on a door. Went away that whole spring, came back with the baby, years of trying, and then all of a sudden, I'm not a detective, but I read probate files for a living, and I know what it looks like when a family rearranges its own history. A woman who can't conceive disappears for a season and returns with an infant, and everyone agrees to call it a miracle, so no one has to call it anything else. I almost stopped there. I want you to know that I had a feeling and a letter from a dead woman and an aunt's loose memory. And a smaller, more frightened version of me wanted to fold it all back into the shoebox and go home and keep being the daughter who didn't make trouble. That version of me had survived 30 years by not knowing things. She was very good at it, but I kept hearing my grandmother's voice. The truth is heavy, but it sets you down somewhere solid. So, I kept pulling threads. I went back to Aunt Josephine once more with a more dangerous question. I asked her plainly this time if she remembered the name of the place in Cornwall, the agency. She got quiet on the phone for a long moment, long enough that I thought she'd hang up. "You already know, don't you?" she said. "You're not asking, you're confirming." I told her I was. I told her about the test, just the shape of it, not the result. And my aunt, who had spent 30 years being kind to me in the small ways that don't cost anything, finally spent something that did. There was a solicitor in Truro, she said, a private placement. Clem and Alistair drove down in March and came back in June with the baby and a story. "Mother, your grandmother, she signed something to help them. Money, I think. And she made them promise to tell that child the truth someday. They never did. A breath. She brought it up every Christmas for years quietly just to Clem. When are you going to tell her?" And Clem would say, "There's nothing to tell." And your grandmother would look at you, Alara, sitting down at the end of the table, and her face would just break. I asked her why no one ever said anything to me. Why I'd spent my whole childhood believing I was the problem. "Because you were the proof, sweetheart," Aunt Josephine said, and her voice cracked. 2 years after they swore up and down Clem couldn't carry a baby, there you were. You were the living evidence that the official story was a lie. Every time your mother looked at you, she saw the thing she'd decided to bury. It was never about you. You were just the only one in that house who couldn't be explained away. I had to sit on the floor of my flat after that call. Not because it was new I'd worked most of it out from the documents, but because hearing another human being say it out loud made it real in a way the paper never could. A document tells you a fact. An aunt's broken voice tells you it cost people something to keep it from you. I want to be careful here because I've watched too many families burn down over half a fact. So, I did one more thing before I let myself believe it all the way. I tracked down the placement records I was entitled to request, and I found a court file from Cornwall, sealed in part, but with enough on the public docket. A finalization of adoption. Spring of 1990. Petitioners, Clementina and Alistair Ellsworth. The names matched. The dates matched the letter. The letter matched my aunt. My aunt matched the DNA. and the DNA matched the only grandmother who ever made me feel like I was worth keeping. 4 independent things, and they all pointed the same direction. In my world, that's not a feeling anymore. That's a finding. I needed records. This is where being a legal executive stopped being a sad joke and started being the most useful thing about me. I knew how to request things. I knew which records were public and which weren't, and how to ask for the public ones without lying. I pulled what I could of Saffron's vital records. And the certified birth certificate on file, the one my mother had always kept in the fireproof box, listed Clementina and Alistair Ellsworth as parents and a hospital in Hampshire. But a birth certificate is just a piece of paper that says what someone swore was true at the time, and the DNA said otherwise. Both things could not be facts. One of them was a story. I went back to my grandmother's papers. Mr. Sterling, bless him, had boxed up her personal correspondence and let me go through it as a beneficiary, and in a shoebox of old letters, rubber-banded by year, I found 1990. There was a letter from my mother to my grandmother, postmarked from Cornwall, spring of 1990. I read it standing up in Mr. Sterling's conference room and had to sit down halfway through. It was careful. It never said the word adoption, but it said things like, "The agency wants to finalize before the court date, and Alistair and I have decided she'll never need to know. And please, Mother, this stays between us. If it ever gets out, it will follow her forever. She'll never need to know." She's Saffron. My grandmother had kept that letter for 36 years. She'd known or half known the whole time. That was the feeling she told me she'd had and wouldn't break the family over. She'd carried it quietly until she was dying. And then she'd gone and gotten the proof. Because a feeling can't change a will, but a DNA report can. Here is what I understood, sitting in that conference room with 36 years of secrets in my hands. Saffron was adopted privately, quietly through an agency down south. In a season, my mother disappeared and reappeared transformed, and my parents had made a choice I still don't fully understand. They'd buried it so deep that they raised Saffron as the firstborn miracle and treated me, their actual biological child, as the afterthought. I'll be honest, for about a day I hated Saffron. It's ugly, but it's true. All those years she got the held-up-to-the-light love I'd starved for. And she wasn't even, and then I stopped myself because I'd done the math the cruel way. And there was a kinder, more terrible truth underneath it. Saffron didn't know either. If my mother wrote, "She'll never need to know," then Saffron had spent her whole life as the chosen one without ever knowing the choice was a cover story. She wasn't my enemy. She was the other half of the same lie. We were 2 daughters raised inside one secret. One of us loved to hide it. One of us pushed aside because I was the living, breathing evidence that my mother could, in fact, have a child of her own. That was the part that broke me, the night I finally understood it. I'd assumed my whole life that I was hard to love. But I think my mother looked at me and saw the proof that the story she'd built her life on was a lie. Every time she looked at her real daughter, she saw the thing she'd spent 30 years pretending wasn't true. So, she pushed the evidence to the end of the table. I sat on my kitchen floor that night with my back against the cabinets and cried the way I hadn't let myself cry since I was a child. The ugly, gulping kind with Biscuit pacing around me, confused. Then I washed my face and made tea and got out a legal pad because I'd learned a long time ago that the only way I know how to survive a thing is to organize it. If you've made it this far with me, you already know I'm not going to do the small, satisfying thing here. I could have walked into a dinner and thrown the report on the table, but I want to ask you to do something first before I tell you what I actually did. Pause for 1 second and guess how you think this ends. Do you think my mother begged forgiveness? Do you think Saffron and I ended up enemies? Hold your guess. Write it down if you want. Because what happened at that table was not what I planned, and it was not what any of them expected. And I promise you, the ending is going to land somewhere you don't see coming. Now, let me show you how I got ready. I want to be clear that I wasn't building a weapon. I was building a floor, something solid to stand on when the ground gave way, which I knew it would the moment I spoke. Over the next 2 weeks, while my mother sent passive-aggressive texts about the family meeting and getting Gran's affairs settled before Saffron's anniversary trip, I quietly assembled everything. I made 3 certified copies of the DNA report and kept the original in Mr. Sterling's safe. I scanned my grandmother's 1990 letter and the entire shoebox of correspondence. I documented the chain of custody, the lab accreditation, the amended will. I wrote out a clean timeline, dated and sourced, the way I'd build a case file. I did not do this because I'm cold. I did it because I knew that the first thing my mother would do, the The very first thing was call it a lie. And while I built my floor, I watched them build their trap. My mother, it turned out, had been busy too. Through the family group chat I was barely in, and through things Saffron said without thinking, I pieced together what my parents were planning for the family meeting. They believed the cottage and trust were theirs to direct toward Saffron. They had already, my mother let slip, spoken to Mr. Sterling about expediting things. They'd told the extended family, the aunts, the cousins, that the reading was a formality. My father had reportedly already promised Saffron and her husband they could use the cottage that very summer. They had no idea the will had been changed. They had no idea what was in that envelope. They were walking toward a door they thought they owned, and behind it was 36 years of their own secret. The cruelest thing my mother did in those 2 weeks, she did without knowing what she was doing. She called me. Actually called, which she almost never did. And in the warmest voice she'd used with me in years, she asked me to be a team player at the meeting. She said, "I know you and I have had our friction, Alara, but family is everything, and Saffron's been through enough stress planning her trip. Let's keep this simple. Let Gran's wishes be honored. Let Gran's wishes be honored." I almost laughed. I said, "I want exactly that, Mum. I want Gran's actual wishes honored." She heard agreement. I meant something she couldn't imagine. There was one moment in those 2 weeks that I keep coming back to. Aunt Josephine called me unprompted. She'd been thinking, she said, about my questions. She was quiet and then she said, "Alara, honey, whatever you're looking into, be careful. Your mother has spent her whole life keeping a certain story straight. People like that, when the story cracks, they don't get sad. They get dangerous." A pause. "But for what it's worth, you were always the one who deserved that cottage. Mama knew it too." Mama, my grandmother. So, Aunt Josephine knew at least some of it. I asked her gently if she'd be at the meeting. She said she would. I told her I might need a witness who'd tell the truth no matter who got upset. There was a long silence on the line. "I've kept that woman's secrets for 30 years, she finally said. "I think I'm done." The weekend before the meeting, I drove up to the Lake District cottage alone. I told myself I went to check on the property since it might soon be my responsibility. That was the lie I told myself. The truth is, I went because I needed to stand in the one place on earth where I'd always been wanted before I walked into the place where I never had been. Mr. Sterling had given me the key. The house was cold and still, sheets over the furniture, but it smelled the same. Wood smoke and lavender soap, 30 years deep in the walls. I walked through it slowly. The screened porch where she taught me gin rummy. The kitchen where she dressed my cut hand and I now knew quietly saved the plaster. The jetty my grandfather built, gone soft and gray at the edges. On the porch, I found the card table still set up, and in the drawer underneath it, her deck of cards, the corners worn round from decades of her hands. There was a photograph tucked in the box with them. I almost didn't look. I'm glad I did. It was me, maybe 11, on that jetty, mid-laugh, holding up a fish I'd caught, and on the back in her handwriting, "Alara, the one who pays attention, the one who stays. Not difficult, not independent, not the one who doesn't need much. The one who pays attention, the one who stays." I sat down on the jetty and I let myself break finally, all the way, with no one to perform restraint for. I cried for the kid in the photo who'd spent the next 20 years believing the opposite of every word on the back of it. I cried for my grandmother who saw me clearly and was overruled by a daughter's secret for 3 decades. And I cried a little for my mother because it must be an exhausting kind of hell to spend your whole life guarding a door and to push away your own flesh and blood because she keeps reminding you the door is there. When I was done, I washed my face in the cold lake and I drove home. And somewhere on the highway, the fear left me and didn't come back. I wasn't walking into that meeting to win an argument. I was walking in to put a 36-year-old burden down on the floor where it belonged. My grandmother had carried it as long as she could. Now it was my turn, and then it would be no one's. I had my floor. I had a witness. I had the report, the letter, the will, and the truth. And I had one decision left, the hardest one, which was how to do this without becoming the kind of person my grandmother would not have recognized. Because here's the thing I kept circling back to on my kitchen floor, on the long drives, in the gray hour before sleep. I could destroy my mother. The materials were right there. I could stand up at that table and break her open in front of everyone she'd ever performed for. And part of me, the 8-year-old with the spelling trophy, wanted that so badly my teeth ached. But my grandmother's note said I was the one of them who was never cruel. She had handed me a weapon and called me kind in the same breath, and I understood it as a dare. Could I hold the truth and not become my mother holding it? I decided I would tell the truth, all of it, exactly as it was. I would not soften it to protect the people who'd never protected me. But I would not aim it at Saffron, who was innocent. I'd aim it where it belonged, at the two people who'd known and chosen for 36 years. The meeting was set for a Saturday in June at my parents' house with Mr. Sterling present to read the will. My mother had turned it into an event, a catered lunch, the good china again, the whole extended family. She wanted witnesses to her coronation. She was about to get witnesses to something else. I drove out that morning with a folder on my passenger seat and my grandmother's note in my pocket. And I was calmer than I'd been in years because for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I belonged. I belonged on the side of the truth. It had just taken 34 years and a dead woman's love to get me there. I got there early on purpose. I wanted 10 minutes alone with my mother before the room filled because whatever happened next, I didn't want her to be able to say I'd ambushed her in front of everyone without giving her a chance to do the decent thing first. She was in the kitchen arranging smoked salmon blinis on a platter, wearing the navy dress she wore to important things. She looked up and gave me the company smile. "Alara, you're early. Make yourself useful. The napkins are in the drawer." I didn't move toward the napkins. I said, "Mum, I need to talk to you for a minute before everyone gets here." Something in my voice made her set the platter down. She crossed her arms. "If this is about the seating, I'm not redoing the—" "It's about Saffron," I said, "and the cottage, and what Gran knew." For just a second, and I will remember this second for the rest of my life, something flickered behind my mother's eyes. Not confusion, recognition. The face of a person who has spent decades waiting for a knock at the door, hearing it at last. She recovered fast. She always did. "I don't know what you think you know," she said, "cool now. But this is a day to honor your grandmother, not to make yourself the center of attention for once." I almost let it go. The old reflex, the duck and cover. Instead, I took the envelope out of my folder. Not the report, just the envelope, the sealed lab return address showing, and I set it on the counter between us next to the salmon. "Gran ordered this last September," I said quietly. "She gave me your hairbrush and my plaster. You know the kind of test it is. I'm asking you one time, as your daughter. Do you want to tell them, or do you want me to?" I watched the color leave my mother's face in real time. She looked at the envelope like it was something alive. Her mouth opened and closed. And then, because she is who she is, she chose the worst possible thing. She lowered her voice to a hiss and she said, "You ungrateful little. We gave you everything, both of you. You will not bring some garbage you bought online into my house and ruin your sister's life over a grudge." So, she knew, there was no other way to read it. I'd given her the door and she'd slammed it. "It's not from online," I said. "It's from Mr. Sterling, and it's not a grudge. It's Gran's." She left it to me. The doorbell rang. The first guests. My mother straightened her dress, fixed her face into the company smile in the space of one breath, and walked past me to answer it. And as she passed, she said, "Lo, you wouldn't dare." I'd spent 30 years being the daughter who wouldn't dare. She'd built her whole comfort on it. The room filled. Aunt Josephine caught my eye across it and gave me a small nod. Saffron arrived with her husband, glowing about her trip, and hugged me and said, "I'm so glad you came. You've been so distant." And I hugged her back and felt the floor of the lie under both our feet. My father shook hands and refilled glasses. Mr. Sterling sat quietly at the end of the table with his briefcase, an old man who'd kept a dying woman's last promise. Lunch was served. The performance began. My mother held court, telling stories about Gran that put herself at the center of each one. And then over coffee, my father tapped his glass and said it was time to talk about the estate. And he turned to Mr. Sterling and he said, with the easy confidence of a man who has never once been told no, "Whenever you're ready, Howard. I think we all know how Beatrix wanted things handled." Mr. Sterling opened his briefcase. He looked at me, one question in his eyes. I nodded. "Actually, Alistair," Mr. Sterling said, "Beatrix was quite specific, and it differs from what I think you're expecting. She amended her will last October. She was fully competent. I had her evaluated, and the documentation is here." He laid the papers on the table. The cottage and the Donovan Trust passed to her direct biological descendants, and she attached a condition of proof. The table went still. My mother's smile didn't move, but her hand found the edge of the table. "What does that mean, biological descendants?" My father said. "We're all. Saffron and Alara are her granddaughters. That's the condition, Mr. Sterling said gently. Beatrix asked that descent be confirmed. She left the instrument of confirmation with Alara. Every face turned to me, and I understood that this was the moment my whole life had been quietly walking toward. I could feel the 8-year-old with the trophy and the 19-year-old packing her car and the woman on the kitchen floor, all of them standing behind me. I kept my grandmother's voice in my head, the one of them who was never cruel. I took out the report. My hands did not shake. Gran loved this family, I said. She also knew it was built on something nobody would say out loud. Before she died, she ordered an accredited DNA test, her own sample, and both of ours. I looked at Saffron when I said the next part because she deserved to hear it from someone who wasn't going to weaponize it against her. Saffron, this isn't about you, and none of what I'm about to say is your fault. You didn't know. I didn't either until 2 weeks ago. Alara, my mother's voice cracked like a whip. Stop this instant. I didn't stop. The test confirms 2 things, I said. First, that I am Beatrix's biological granddaughter. The maternal line matches over 99.9%. I slid the page to the center of the table, the gray summary box facing up. And second, I said, and for the first time, my voice almost went, and I let it because my grandmother told me emotion held too tightly turns to stone. That Saffron is not. Not Beatrix's, not Mum's. The maternal line excludes her completely. The silence after that had a sound. It was the sound of 36 years of a story coming apart. My mother stood up. This is a lie, she said. Too loud. This is a forgery. Alara has always been jealous. She's always wanted to tear this family apart. She's bought some fake document to humiliate us. And here is where it went the way it always goes when a lie tries to outrun the truth, because Mr. Sterling cleared his throat and said mildly, Clementina, I commissioned the lab on Beatrix's behalf myself. The chain of custody is documented. The lab is court accredited. I'd be cautious about the word forgery. My mother snatched the page off the table. I let her. I'd brought 3 copies and the original was in Mr. Sterling's safe. A person who has watched families fight over documents for a living does not bring the only copy to the fight. She scanned it and I watched her eyes move and stop and move and stop. And I watched the exact instant she ran out of room to pretend. This proves nothing, she said, but it came out thin. DNA tests are wrong. There are stories all the time. Then explain the letter, I said. I took it out. Then the second receipt, the one I'd been holding. I'd had it enlarged and printed so the room could see it. I held it up. Her own handwriting, 36 years old. The agency wants to finalize before the court date. Alistair and I have decided she'll never need to know. This is your handwriting, Mum, I said quietly. From Cornwall. Gran kept it for 36 years. Should I read it out loud, or do you want to tell them what's in it? A cousin near the end of the table, Saffron's cousin, my cousin, a lad in university named Finlay, said into the silence, Aunt Clem, is that real? And my mother, who had spent her whole life managing every room she walked into, looked at a 19-year-old and had no performance left to give him. My mother turned on Mr. Sterling and then on me, and her composure, the thing she'd worn my whole life like armor, finally cracked all the way down. You don't understand what you've done, she said to me, shaking. You don't understand what it took to give that girl a normal life. What girl, Clementina? Aunt Josephine's voice, quiet from down the table. She stood up too. Say it. After 36 years. Say it out loud or I will. Saffron had gone white. She was looking between her mother and her aunt and the page on the table, and her voice, when it came, was very small. Mum, what is she talking about? What does give me a normal life mean? My mother opened her mouth. Nothing came out. And in that silence, my father, who had refilled wine through 30 years of my life and never once defended me, put his face in his hands and said, muffled and broken, We adopted you, Saffron, in Cornwall in 1990. We never told you. We never told anyone. I have replayed the next part 100 times. Saffron didn't scream. She didn't cry, not at first. She just looked at the 2 people who'd raised her, and then she looked at me and she said the thing that told me she was, underneath everything, a good person caught in a bad lie. Then why? She said to our parents, her voice rising for the first time. Why did you spend my whole life telling Alara she didn't belong? She's the only one of us who actually, she's your real. Saffron couldn't finish it. She turned to me, this sister I'd resented for 30 years, and she said, Alara, I'm so sorry, I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know. That was the moment the table stopped being theirs and started being ours. My mother tried one more time to reach for the steering wheel of the story. She always had to be driving. Everyone needs to calm down, she said. These results? These things are wrong all the time. We can get our own test. We can. I agreed. Get your own. I'll pay for it. Use any lab you like. I'm not afraid of the answer, Mum. You are. You've been afraid of it for 36 years. That's the whole reason I grew up at the end of the table. She had no reply because there wasn't one. The room had seen it now. The aunts, the cousins, my father broken open. Josephine standing like a witness in a courtroom. There was no smile left to put on. The performance was over, and the only thing left on the stage was the truth, which had been there all along, waiting for someone brave enough or dying enough to turn the lights on. Mr. Sterling, in his quiet solicitor's way, brought us back to earth. The will stands as written, he said. The cottage and the trust passed to Beatrix's confirmed biological descendant. That is Alara. He looked at me, and there was something in his old face that I think was my grandmother's, borrowed. Beatrix also left you a letter to read after this. She thought you might need it about now. The lunch did not recover. There was no dessert, no coffee refilled, no graceful close. The catered platters sat there going cold while my mother stood at the head of her own table with nothing left to serve. One by one, the relatives made their excuses. An aunt with a long drive, a cousin who suddenly remembered somewhere to be. People do that when a family's private weather turns violent in public. They reach for their coats. My father never lifted his head from his hands. My mother kept saying variations of the same 3 sentences. It's not what it looks like. We did what we had to. You've all turned on me, to a room that was emptying out from under her. Finley, the university kid, hugged me on his way out and whispered, "For what it's worth, you were always the cool aunt's kid," which made me laugh for the first time in 2 weeks. Aunt Josephine stayed until the end, washing dishes my mother had stopped pretending to care about. And on her way out, she held my face in both her hands and said, "Mama would be so proud of you." She's proud of you right now. I chose to believe her. Saffron and her husband left early, not angry at me, at them. She texted me from the car before they'd even reached the motorway. "I don't have a single thing figured out right now except that you're my sister and I should have seen it. Can we get coffee this week?" I said yes before she finished typing. I was the last to go. I packed up my folder, the copy's the original of nothing. I'd kept the real document safe the whole time, which my mother only seemed to register at the very end. The realization that the daughter she dismissed as the difficult one had quietly out-prepared her. As I reached the door, she said my name. "Just Alara." I turned. I waited. I gave her the opening one last time, the same way I had in the kitchen that morning. She couldn't take it. "You've ruined this family," is what she chose. I looked at her for a long moment, this woman whose approval I'd hunted for 34 years, and I felt the hunt finally end. Not with her giving me what I wanted, but with me stopping wanting it from her. "No, Mum," I said. "You hid a child for 36 years and made the other one feel like a stranger to cover it. I just turned the lights on. What you do in the light is up to you." And I left. I want to tell you that winning felt like winning. It didn't exactly. Watching my mother's face fall apart was not the warm bath of revenge I'd imagined as an angry kid. It was just sad. It was a woman who'd spent her whole life protecting a secret that had cost her the one daughter who was actually hers. If you've ever waited years for an apology that never comes, if there's a person in your life who has finally been shown the truth and still can't say they're sorry, I want you to hear what I figured out at that table because it took me 34 years and I'd give it to you for free. You will not get your healing from their confession. It isn't coming. You get your healing from somewhere else, and I'm about to tell you where I found mine. Here is what the cottage turned out to be worth, and it was not the money. In the weeks after that lunch, the family rearranged itself the way families do after an earthquake, along new fault lines, with some people on my side of the crack and some on theirs. My parents did get their own test. I knew they would, and I knew what it would say. It said exactly what Gran said. They never told me the result. I heard it from Aunt Josephine. They simply went quiet the way they'd always gone quiet at me. Except now the silence was theirs to sit in. My mother has not apologized. I don't think she knows how. The story she built was load-bearing, and pulling it out brought the whole house down. And I think she's still standing in the rubble, insisting it's a house. My father called me once, late, and got as far as Alara. before his voice gave out and we sat on the phone in silence for a minute, and then he said, "Good night, sweetheart," which is the most fathering thing he's ever done. I'm letting that be enough for now. I'm not holding my breath for more. The surprise of my life is Saffron. We had coffee 2 weeks after both of us wrung out. She told me she'd never questioned why our mother was warmer to her. She'd just assumed I was difficult the way they'd taught her to. She cried about that, the assuming. And then she said something I think about all the time. She said, "We were both being used, Alara. You to hide me to hide the lie. Neither of us got to just be a kid. She's not my enemy, she never was. We are two women who survived the same secret from opposite ends, and we're slowly, carefully becoming the actual sisters our parents never let us be." She didn't want the cottage. She told me Gran got it right. I told her she's welcome there any summer she likes. And I meant it, because a cottage full of one person isn't an inheritance. It's just a sad place with a good jetty. I read my grandmother's last letter alone on that jetty the first weekend I owned the place. I'll share the end of it because it's the thing that actually healed the wound, not the will. "My Alara," she wrote, "I'm sorry it took my whole life to give you proof of what I always knew. You were never the one who didn't belong. You were the one who belonged so completely that your mother couldn't look at you. Don't waste another year auditioning for people who graded you on a test you were always failing on purpose. You passed mine the day you were born. The house is yours. So is the lake and the jetty your grandfather built. And every summer I'm not here for, fill them with people who hold you up to the light. Love always and already, Beatrix." I sat on that jetty until the sun went down. I didn't cry much. The wound that ran my whole life, the certainty that I was hard to love, that there was a defect in me my own mother could feel, it didn't vanish. Wounds don't. But it set down finally somewhere solid, exactly like she promised. I was never unlovable. I was just inconvenient to a lie. There is a world of difference, and I'd spent 30 years on the wrong side of it. So, here's where I'll leave you because I think some of you needed to hear this more than you needed to hear the rest of my family's mess. The people who made you feel like you didn't belong were almost always protecting something in themselves, not telling you the truth about yourself. The defect you've been hunting for, paying therapists to help you find, isn't there. It was never there. You were just standing in the light of someone else's secret and they couldn't stand to look at you. You don't need them to admit it. Mine never will. You just need one person, living or gone, who held you up to the light and saw you clearly. And if you can't find one, then you become that person for yourself and for whoever comes after you at the end of the table. I own the cottage now. I play gin rummy on the porch with whoever I choose. And the seat at the head of the table is mine. Not because I fought for it, but because the one person who ever truly saw me made sure with her dying breath that I'd finally stop sitting near the door. I belonged all along. So do you. Go find your jetty.